Oh, welcome to building the Stormy 45, and this is a fun project. I'm really looking forward to doing it together. We have all the parts in the sheets in front of us, and we're ready to start cutting them out. First project when you get the kit is probably to do an inventory and check against the parts list, make sure you have all the parts, and start to identify what the parts are called. Just a brief introduction to the Stormy 45 concept. It's a launch built in the Victorian or Edwardian style of very sleek, elegant boats that moved easily through the water and were powered either, in this case, they'll be powered either by an electric motor or a steam engine, depending on which version you're building. Very similar. The build is very similar in both cases. The departure from when you decide to build the steam versus the electric is quite a ways down the line in the building process. This boat was developed in coordination with Carl Miller in Hawaii. We've been collaborating on this project, but on a number of projects before this. Carl's actually built essentially every boat that Tippecanoe Boats has ever designed from our kits, and done splendid work and beautiful craftsmanship on those builds and those boats. And then he started getting interested in these launches, and I was enjoying visiting and watching the progress of these launches, and decided it would be a great addition to our Tippecanoe line. And so this boat we've developed together, and Carl's built several prototypes, and we have it refined to the point that it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous, elegant yacht that moves very smoothly through the water and is very stable and fun to run and fun to build. So it's been a nice process working together. We seem to think along the same lines as far as solving engineering solutions in a clean and straightforward way. And have come out with a boat that I think will be a lot of fun to build and a lot of fun to run. So let's get started. My recommendation is that you leave the parts in the sheets primarily until you need the parts, especially the smaller parts. If you want to pull out the bigger pieces like the sides or the bottom panels, that's fine. But generally speaking, with the smaller parts, it'll be easier to identify what part is what if they're still in the sheets until you're ready to work with that part. So first off this morning, we'll do some laminating. It's good to read the instruction manual on how to use epoxy and how to use cyanoacrylate, CA, and familiarize yourself with both of those adhesives that we'll be using in this process. But so we won't go over all that material, although I will give you some tips as we work together. So I think it's this sheet number 4 that we're starting with primarily. And what we want from this sheet is part number, you can refer to your manual for the description of the parts on the parts pictures, which are labeled. What we want is part number 3B and 3A. So that's this part. Now 3B is the part here that I'm just about to break out of the sheet, but it's a very delicate part. So rather than breaking it out, I'll cut the tabs and pre it, because if you try to push this part out, it may break where it's very thin here and here. This part will be laminated onto 3A, so it'll be quite strong when it's done. But if you break it now, it'll just be a little bit more work gluing it up, in place. So it's a good idea to use just a utility knife, an X-Acto knife, or these mat knives are called Olfa knives, the OLFA, and they are a step up from the standard utility knife. As you can see, it's a blade that slides out to any length you want, has breakaway lines, or you can actually sharpen these blades on a whetstone just like a regular knife quite easily. And then when you can set it to the depth you want, so it's a little bit safer than a regular mat knife. And then you just tighten up the little knob here, the ratchet knob, and it'll stay that length. That looks a little short though. So OLFA. They're not too expensive, and you'll never go back to a regular mat knife after these. Okay, so here's that first part. Now, those tabs holding the pieces in are still going to leave, even when you cut them off pretty smoothly, they're still going to leave bumps that we want to sand off. So now this part I might just cut a few of the tabs, and then I expect it'll pivot up and release itself. But you want to be fairly careful, yeah. So I didn't have to cut all the way around it, but if I cut two sides, then the third side just comes up easily. And then we want to do 4A and oh no, we don't need to do 4A right now. We want to do 5A and 5B. So these two over here. We'll leave 4A in place right now because we don't need it. So again, this is 5A is again one of the fragile ones until it's laminated on. So I'm going to cut all the way around this one. Now just a quick note, in case you're reading the instructions more quickly because you're watching the video as your primary source. On sheet 2, no, it's sheet 3. Where are we? Here we are. Sheet 3, which has the entire deck shape on it. It's important, especially on this sheet, not to punch out any of the parts or the oval shape inside the cockpit area. Keep this intact, because if the center part or the parts inside the center part of the cockpit area are taken out, the edges of the deck will not be very well supported at this point. Later on we'll put on some braces that go across, and then the deck will be much better supported. And when the whole boat is built, it's very strong. So, but don't pop the parts out. You can take the deck part out; it's quite loose. Only has a few tabs holding it in. But don't take the parts out of the center of the cockpit area within the deck. Okay, I think we got everything cleaned up, and now we're ready to mix the epoxy. We'll be using the pre-thickened epoxy, and using the syringes, the marked syringes. Review the instruction manual about putting the scale onto the syringes. And the resin syringe has the scale that goes all the way up. Because we always use more resin. The mixture is 5 resin to 1 hardener. So 5 parts of resin to 1 hardener. Each of the large marks is 5 small marks. So if we do 1 large mark of resin, we would want to do 1 small mark of hardener. And just a quick note on the hardener syringe, frequently we'll be doing just 1 or 2 marks of hardener if it's a small batch of epoxy. I never trust that bottom mark as much as the other marks. So if I want just 1 mark of hardener, I'll pull maybe 3 marks of hardener into the syringe and then just carefully squeeze out the 1 mark into my mixture and then squeeze the other 2 marks, the remaining marks, into the hardener container. Make sure you don't confuse which syringe is for which material. You don't want to start using the resin syringe in the hardener because the syringe will be ruined and because the material will set up in it. The other thing about epoxy is some people who have used it extensively for years, and even people sometimes, although less often, who have only used it a little bit, will develop an allergic reaction to it, where they will get a red rash on their hands from using it. So skin contact with epoxy is what will initiate a rash and an allergic reaction. So you want to avoid getting epoxy on your skin. If you do get it on your fingers, use paper towels right away and wipe it off, or use paper towels first and then soap and warm water to wash it off. And be very meticulously careful about not getting epoxy on your hands or on your work surface or on your tools or anywhere other than on the pieces that you're gluing together. Once you get a drop of epoxy on your work surface, it's going to end up getting on everything else, and everything will turn out to be sticky, and it won't be nearly as easy to work with as if you're meticulously clean and neat and have paper towels right within reach always. And it's good to have a trash can right beside you to throw the paper towels in. Once you've used a paper towel to clean up a little spot of epoxy, throw it away, because next time if you pick up the same paper towel, you're going to grab it with the place that has the epoxy on it. Gloves are a very good idea for any epoxy. You can wear them all the way through on all your epoxy jobs, or some jobs you really can do carefully and neatly without getting any epoxy on your hands. So gloves, thin surgical gloves, I like the vinyl ones, the non-powdered vinyl gloves. Get them larger than your real size. You don't want to have to struggle to get them on and off. Just have them be a slightly loose fit, although not huge, because if they're huge, the fingertips will start getting into the epoxy when you don't mean them to. Okay, so we'll start with, see, we have a few pieces here. So let's start with, I think we'll go with, let's start with just 2 pre-thickened resin, 2 large marks of pre-thickened resin. That's going to be a little bit close, but if you're working in a warm environment, you do want to mix smaller batches at a time, because you'll find it goes off more quickly. Remember from reading in the manual about epoxy that every 10 degrees of temperature increase in the ambient air will make the epoxy set off twice as fast. Okay, so 2 large marks of resin and 2 small marks of hardener. So I'll pull 5 marks into my hardener syringe, and then I'll just squeeze out 2 of those marks in my mixing container, 1 and 2, and then I'll squirt the rest back into the hardener reservoir. Okay, just a quick note, these orange juice jars, cut off frozen orange juice cans, are really perfect for mixing small batches of epoxy. They're very nice because the epoxy actually sticks to the inside when it sets up, as opposed to little plastic drinking cups, where the epoxy, you can only use those once because the epoxy will flake off the inside and get chunks of hardened epoxy in your mixture, and you don't want that. So any kind of plastic mixing cup or drinking cup that you use can work, but you'll go through quite a few of them, whereas with these orange juice containers, you can use them over and over and over again. Also, these have a metal bottom, so if you want to get your epoxy for a small job going off a little bit more quickly, or if your workshop is especially cool in the winter, you can heat the epoxy in the container as you mix it just by holding the container, touching a 100 watt incandescent light bulb, and you'll find that the epoxy goes almost water liquid, and then it's going to set off quite quickly after that. If you keep heating it, it'll set off before you finish mixing it. So so you can get some of these smaller jobs to set off, and it'll be ready to use in an hour, as opposed to if it's 50 degrees in your shop, it would be overnight otherwise before it set off. So these work out really well. Just cut them off down, and then they also work well for setting your syringes in. You do need something to set your syringes in, because a little epoxy residue will be left in the syringes, and it'll leak out into your containers, whatever you're using. So just a timely note here. Between the two, the hardener and the resin, the hardener is more likely to cause an allergic reaction. Once the hardener is mixed in the resin, it's slightly more benign and less likely to cause an allergic reaction. So be especially careful with the hardener, especially cautious with it. And I had just a little sticky patch on the side of my container. I don't know how that happened. So rather than just kind of ignore it, it's time to wipe it off right away so you don't get other things sticky with your sticky fingers. Okay, and now the epoxy brushes. They're very convenient, but they need trimming. So these come with bristles that are twice as long as what you want for epoxy, and so you can take all your epoxy brushes and trim them right off, because they'll all be trimmed for the epoxy work. And so you can just squeeze the bristles with one hand, and then try to get a square cut right across with the other hand with the scissors. And it takes a bit of practice to get it as square as you really want it. So it should turn out about like that. So the bristles are just half as long as they are originally. And you'll notice that the pre-thickened epoxy and the clear epoxy are both sort of more white in color, and the hardener is typically more yellow in color. So before you start mixing, you can look in your pot and make sure you can see the hardener in there, that you haven't forgotten to add the hardener, because epoxy resin will never get hard by itself. It doesn't dry or by exposure to the air or anything. 10 years later, the epoxy resin, if you didn't mix hardener in it, will still be a liquid. So so don't forget to mix your hardener into the resin. That's an easy mistake to make. Don't forget how many large marks of hardener of resin you've put into your container. It's not a good idea to answer the phone halfway through measuring your epoxy amounts, because then you come back from the phone and it's like, did I put the hardener in or not? And how many marks of resin did I put in my container? So that's the only real mistake. Or also mixing the wrong proportions. One person did once mix equal amounts of hardener and resin, and I was interested to see what the result was. It did set up, but it was not very strong. You could gouge it with your fingernail quite easily. It was sort of rubbery and not very strong. Whereas when it's mixed correctly, there's no way you could damage it with your fingernail at all. Mix thoroughly, because any of that mixture that didn't get mixed will not set up. Okay, and we're going to add a very small amount of phenolic powder to this. The phenolic thickening powder Gives you a slightly thicker mixture. And for this, since we're just putting thin coats on each side of the pieces, on the inside sides of the pieces where they're glued together, we really don't need a very thick mixture, and we don't need very much resin applied either, because if any excess resin is just going to squeeze out all over the place and make a mess. So let's just use this fairly light amount of, that was about half a teaspoon. It's about this much of the powder. It's slightly heaping. If you leveled that off, it's about 2/3 of the teaspoon of the phenolic powder. And let's see what that does. We want it to be pretty still, you know, pretty liquid. It definitely would sag and run if we tried to hold it up on the brush. In fact, you can see that. See, it's you know, it's still pretty liquid there. It's sagging right off. Okay, so it'll spread very easily. Now, take your parts and take a look at them. You can put them together either way. Choose the outside as the nicer side of plywood, whichever side you like best. Have the outside showing, the part that's going to show as the nicer side. And those are all arranged right. Any fuzz that you didn't get cleaned off is going to be a bit of a nuisance here. Once the epoxies, once you start using the epoxy. So try to get the fuzz all cleaned off before you begin spreading your epoxy. Okay, and you can see this looks nice and even. That's just right. Now remember which side is your good side, and spread epoxy on the inside part. One way to make sure you're not going to mess up with spreading epoxy on the side you meant to be your good side is to put a pencil X on the side that is going to be the inside side that you're going to spread the epoxy on, and then you're less likely to make a mistake when you grab the piece to put the epoxy on. Now, right now we're working at a temperature, it's probably only about 50 degrees in here, so so I have lots of time for this epoxy. It's not going to set up on me for quite a while, so no rush really in putting these together. Okay, now we'll apply our binder clips. If you put that binder clip up fairly high away from the edge, you'll be able to see how much squeezes out underneath the binder clip. And you should have a small amount of epoxy squeeze out everywhere all the way around. Don't put binder clips right over your cutouts there, because you want to be able to clean the epoxy out of those. Make sure the cutouts are lined up exactly with each other, and a couple more binder clips and we'll be good. There should just be a very thin bead of epoxy squeezing out all around the edges. Anywhere it's not, there's no epoxy visible, add another binder clip. And then anywhere you have more epoxy squeezing out than you want, use your brush to clean it off. It's definitely much easier to clean off, especially out of these dips and curved places. It's much easier to clean off the epoxy while it's wet than after it's set up hard. On the straight surfaces, it's pretty easy to sand it off. You can remove a binder clip, clean off the epoxy underneath where the binder clip was, and then replace the binder clip. Okay, nice. And we will let that set up, and we'll go on to our other pieces. Now, I think you've seen how that goes, so I'll go ahead and finish up these other pieces, and then we'll be back for the next step. Terrific! Oh, we've got a good start on it already, on the working with the epoxy and getting the bases, the stand together, and so we're launched and started on our project. Okay, so here are our pieces, this face-to-face pieces spread, and I had just barely enough for these upright stand pieces, with that two large marks of resin and 2 small marks of hardener. There's nothing left. So that'll give you some idea of how thick to spread it. And so if you had a lot of extra, you're probably spreading it too thin. And if you ran out, you're probably spreading it too thick and you're going to have a little extra cleanup to get the around the edges. And have to do more work and be a little bit messier because you're getting more stuff squeezing out. So that's a good way to gauge how thick to be spreading it, and you get better and better at it and faster at it as you work with it. Okay, it's important to have the slots lined up with each other, because otherwise the piece won't slot together without some additional sanding. And we're always a little bit lazy about the sanding. Whenever we can avoid sanding, we do. Okay, and there we are. Nice. Remember, clean the epoxy out of the slots with your brush as it squeezes out, because otherwise you're going to have to file that out once it gets hard. Okay, nice. Then you can clean off any epoxy. Is so easy to move when it's liquid, and it's much less easy to move once it's hard. So any cleanup you do while the epoxy is still liquid is like money in the bank. Saves you a lot of time later on. So revisit the slots especially, because you'll find more epoxy squeezes out as the clamping pressure starts to push the epoxy out. Oh, one other factor, as much as possible, try not to get sticky fingerprints all over your pieces, because the epoxy is going to, when you varnish these pieces, you could paint them nice matte or gloss white would look nice too, but they're nice wood. You might want to varnish them, and if you get a lot of epoxy fingerprints all over them, or epoxy blobs, the wood will be slightly discolored by the epoxy and will show through, those areas will show through the varnish and look a little less neat. So do try to be meticulously neat about your wood pieces. Okay, and there we are. We'll let those set up. We're just going to set them like this. Now that was just the right amount of epoxy, but we haven't done our long runners yet. They look like they'll take the same amount of epoxy as the uprights. So we're going to mix another 2 batches of 2 large marks of resin with 2 small marks of hardener. And again, we're going to use the pre-thickened, and then we'll clamp those pieces, long runner pieces, together with paper clamps, binder clips, just the same as we have done the upright pieces. Okay, I think you're in good shape there, and when these set up, we'll put our stand together and start to work on our boat, building our Stormy 45 Edwardian or Victorian motor launch. Okay, talk to you soon. Now we have all our pieces setting up. As an exception to the idea of not getting any epoxy on the wood pieces, on the surface of the wood pieces, You can use a squeeze out to coat the edges, the end grain of the plywood, the edges of the plywood, and that gives you all sorts of good options. If you decide to paint the uprights white, that could look very, very striking, or any color, and varnish the long runners. That can be a very nice combination. You'll have a much better painted surface if you do fill the end grain with epoxy at this point. You can fill the end grain just with the epoxy that squeezes out, brushing it on smoothly, but it will be better not to get epoxy on the faces of the wood, and especially on the runners if you're going to varnish those. If you're going to varnish everything, having the slightly darker mixture of epoxy on the end grain, your varnish surface will build up more quickly, and the painted surface will be smoother over the varnish rather than just onto the end grain where the paint or varnish will soak in so quickly. One other point here is the question of why did we use pre-thickened here instead of clear epoxy? Well, if you just use clear epoxy alone on wood and then glue the surfaces together, sometimes the clear will go on, it goes on quite thin because it's easy to brush out, and sometimes the wood will soak up so much of the clear epoxy that you're left with a dry joint, which essentially is a joint without any glue in it. So rather than use, you could use clear and then use a thickened mixture. Maybe one option would be to brush on the clear on the wood to saturate the wood, and then thicken it with phenolic powder. Thicken the clear resin with phenolic powder and brush that on. But that takes two applications as opposed to what we did, which was just one application. The pre-thickened resin is still going to saturate the wood surface, but it's not going to keep soaking into the wood as much as, especially when we've added some of the phenolic powder, the brown powder. It's not going to soak into the wood so much as just the clear, and so we will not be left with a dry joint where all the epoxy is soaked into the wood. And it's just one application. So that's a little bit easier than coating the pieces with clear first and then applying a pre-thickened or a thickened version of the epoxy as a second coat. The strongest joints, though, will be created by coating with clear, especially on really dense woods like mahogany or white oak or teak. There you definitely want to coat just with clear. If you were building a full-size boat, coat with clear and then apply a thickened mixture on top of the clear and do your joint that way. But on these pieces with the big flat surface areas being joined together, they are so strong that there's no possibility of ever separating. If you tried to chisel them apart, you'd find you were chiseling the wood away before the joint ever even gave any sign of letting go. One other note, we shipped all over the world, shipped parts all over the world, and moisture content of the air and humidity and temperature is very different sometimes at the landing point versus where we shipped it. The parts are flat when we ship them, but you can experience some warping or distortion of the parts, especially if sheet is left exposed to the air with one side facing up. If the air is really dry, that side will dry out and you'll get it dished. The plywood will be somewhat hollow on that side and dished upwards. If the moisture content of the air is extremely high and is just getting to one surface of the plywood, then that side will expand with the moisture and make the plywood dish the other way, curve down. So when you're gluing these pieces up, if there's any sign that when you've got them clamped together that they're curved or distorted, try to flatten them out and reclamp them so they are held straight. And once they set up, the epoxy joining the two pieces together will make them stay straight. Okay, those are just a few tips on getting your stand to come out exactly true and even. again, I'd go back and check a second time. I've wiped off the excess epoxy that's squeezing out around, and then removing the clamps one at a time to wipe out off any epoxy under the clamps that's squeezed out. I've done that twice, and so I have pretty clean surfaces now. But if I'd only cleaned off the epoxy squeezing out once, I would have more sanding to do to clean up the parts. Also, make sure you clean out the epoxy in the slots a second time, because they're a little harder to sand. You have to use a file or some other tool to clean out the epoxy in the slots. Okay, we'll let that set up, and then we're on to building the boat. Now back to where we were at. So again, this piece 5B is fairly strong, but I'll just cut along two sides and then pop that out. Okay. Oh, and just one more note. This table covering is a plastic that epoxy won't stick to. Any sort of plastic, even slicing open a garbage bag and spreading it out will work fine. This is, the yellow is kind of nice, isn't it? Especially on a sort of overcast gray day here in the winter. You can see it's really cold in the shop here. That's why I have fairly heavy set of coveralls on and sweaters. So the yellow's nice. This is quite affordable. It comes as quite a significant roll, probably enough to cover this table 20 times. And it's called banquet table covering for events. In fact, let's see, if you want to Google it, it's banquet table roll. Banquet table roll is a good start if you're Googling and trying to find it. But any type of clear poly plastic will work fine, or black poly will work fine. It's just the yellow is awfully nice though. Okay, so these two parts, and then again checking our guide, we want to take out 7B and 7A, because those will get laminated together, and we want to take out the drake tail upper support, and then we'll look for the other two drake tail pieces that go onto this. Now here, this piece, you know, you want to be careful with these pieces, but if you pop them out carefully, usually the tabs will let go without damaging the piece at all. Just don't be careless with it. But the knife is the surefire way to get the pieces out. If you just kind of push right at from underneath, right where the tab is, typically the tabs will break free. Okay, and so we have these pieces. The next step will be to sand the tabs off and clean up the edges a little bit where they're fuzzy from the cutting process. Oh, let's get our last piece out. Oh, there are two more pieces here. In sheet number 3, we'll want to take out the rudder post support pieces, because those will get laminated together as well. So those are here at the end of sheet 3, behind the back end of the deck piece. Now this tab's, for some reason, just a little bit harder to break, so I'm going to cut it. So don't feel... It only takes a second to cut the tabs, so don't feel anxious to break them all if they aren't coming out easily. Okay, and here's these two pieces. And the last piece I'm looking for now is for the drake tail upper support doubler. With doubler, when we say doubler, we just mean a piece that is glued onto a similar shaped piece to make it twice as thick and give it more support. So let's find those pieces. There are two of them because they're in two pieces, two halves, and they should be, no, not 6. Here they are. Those are in sheet number 5. And this is one of the narrower sheets here, sheet number 5. And of course these numbers are upside down when they're right for me, but sheet number 5 here. And it's these two little pieces down here that you can see are kind of little curves that will match with the drake tail upper support piece. Again, anytime it takes more force than you think is safe, use the knife to cut these pieces out. Okay, there we are. Now that should be all the parts we need to start, and we'll be laminating these parts together. And it's a good place to start with epoxy if epoxy is sort of a new skill for you, because they're fairly small jobs and we shouldn't run out of time. Time is really the big thing with working with epoxy. I'm going to be very relaxed because it's probably only 50 degrees in here, and so that gives me lots of time to work. If it's 70 is a very comfortable temperature. If it gets over 70, you need to work a little bit quicker. Every 10 degrees of temperature increase, the epoxy will set off twice as fast. So at 80 degrees, the epoxy, if you have 15 minutes of working time at 70 degrees, you only have 7.5 minutes of working time at 80 degrees. And at 90 degrees, you might only have 4 or 5 minutes of working time. A lot of it depends on the temperature of the resin when you start, but it's a combination of the temperature of the resin and the temperature of the air temperature. On small jobs, when it is cooler, I'll often mix the resin and then stir it and mix it over a light bulb with the bottom of the container touching the light bulb until the resin is fairly liquid. You'll see its consistency changes quite quickly with heat, becomes more liquid, and then I'll apply it, and sometimes you can get, if you do it just right, you can get it set off in about half hour, 45 minutes. If you heat it too much, it'll set off before you, while you're still stirring it. So be careful with that. Okay, in fact, when you're heating it, you'll see it go to almost a water consistency. It's getting close to setting off instantly in your pot at that point. Although you can still, you don't heat it anymore after that, because it'll set right off. You'll see a little vapor coming off the surface, and then bang, it's hard. So heating it can work in for small jobs. Don't heat it for a bigger job ever. Okay, let's get these pieces, make sure we got the right pieces together. These keel pieces should be exactly lined up with each other, and should line up just right. Yeah, and those look good. Okay, and these pieces, the drake tail support pieces, are also going to line up just right. And so we'll set these in their groups. And now on this, these two pieces, there is the possibility of getting things backwards. So we have to be careful there. You can do it either this way, which gives you one result, or this way, which gives you a different result. Either way, you want to make sure that these slots line up. However, that still gives you two options. Okay, so we have these pieces, these holes cut pretty square just by doing it this way. Remember, always cut away from your hand, so if your blade slips, you're not going to slice yourself. Never cut in towards the hand that you're holding the piece with. Always be cutting away from the hand that's holding the piece, and then you'll be totally safe if you slip. Okay, now we have our sanding blocks here. these are fairly nice blocks. There are a few ways to make sanding blocks. These are commercial ones, and they have a flexible rubber piece here and a little short nail tips sticking out there underneath the flap. And so they grab the sandpaper and you let it down. One side it's nice to have in flat, and the other side almost always has a fold in it when you put it in. It's hard to get it to slide in all the way flat. Taking the edges, the little tabs off and the fuzz off, you really want about a 120 grit sandpaper or so. This other one's a little bit coarse and would kind of mess up the edges a little bit. It's about an 80 grit. So we're using the 120. You see, this is a purple sandpaper. Any sandpaper, production paper will work. Garnet paper is really not advised. It really isn't very sharp, doesn't sand very well. But a production paper will work well. This, however, is the 3M professional sandpaper, and it's a little bit more expensive, but it's really very affordable still. And a little hard to find sometimes, but it's the purple and it's called 3M professional paper. You can find it online easily. You can also find it in Sherwin-Williams paint stores usually, and some hardware stores will carry it as well. It really does, in the end it's cheaper because it lasts twice as long, at least, maybe even 3 or 4 times as long as regular sandpaper, and it cuts faster, and it doesn't clog up nearly as quickly as regular sandpaper or production paper. So it's a good investment, and only trouble with it is it's so good. Once you use it, you won't want to use any other sandpaper again. You'll stick with this. Okay, so we'll get all these parts cleaned up and ready to laminate, and then we'll be back with you. Okay, you can see the cleanup is just very quick and easy to clean up the edges and get the fuzz off. Don't sand aggressively though. You don't want to change the shape of any of these pieces by sanding too aggressively. And don't even think of using a power sander of any sort on this process, because you will end up changing the shape no matter how careful you are, because this is just a very light sanding job. So just sand by hand. Oh, and back to the sanding blocks. Just a flat block of wood, you can wrap the sandpaper around and hold it, or a flat block of wood, you can cut the sandpaper to shape to fit the block. And then, although don't use scissors, you ruin the scissors in one cut on sandpaper. Cut sandpaper with some sort of utility blade from the back side of the sandpaper, or I like to use a hacksaw blade to split, fold the sheet in half with the grit in, and then slice it with the hacksaw blade, a used hacksaw blade that is no longer as functional because it's pretty dull by that point. And then another way is to cut the sandpaper to fit the shape of the block, just a little, maybe a 3" by 3" block or 4" by 4", and then glue it on with contact cement or 3M spray adhesive glue. So that can make a real nice sanding block as well. Okay, now just a few points here. We've got the edges cleaned up nicely. So the fuzz is off and the tabs are off. And on these V-shaped floors, I just want to point out that there is a notch at the outer edge of each floor, and that is supposed to be there. So don't try to sand the floors so it's flat all the way across. At the outside edge of each floor, there's a notch. About the thickness, the depth of the notch is the same as the thickness of the plywood. Another point on this piece, you're going to need, there are two things. First of all, these two pieces look fairly similar, but they are not identical. 7A and 7B are not identical. And so don't try to sand them to the same shape. They're not identical because at this part of the boat, the transom wraps in quite sharply there. And so 7A and 7B are slightly different in shape, although the top edges will be aligned, and across here and here, and the cutout will be aligned. So that cutout should mate perfectly. And So that's one point. The other point is, as we observed before, they're different. You could get this put together wrong, and because there are two ways that this you could put it together wrong, knowing this problem. You could still do it easily enough, glue it together so the notches, the oval cut, oblong cut through the piece doesn't line up with the other piece. So it would be like this. So make sure that's the first mistake. That eliminates two possible ways of putting it together that are incorrect. And then the other way is this piece could, the 7B, 7B is the one with the square holes in it. 7B could be put on with the wrong side facing 7A. So to get it right, I put the set the wooden blocks in. Oh, also you want to find these two 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch by 7/8 inch long square blocks in your parts box, because you'll need them at this stage. And so I put the blocks in correctly. So let's talk about how these are, so you don't find you've glued it together the wrong way. So when I'm looking at it here, these two blocks are slightly off center to the right hand side, to my right hand side. Right, that's in the, when you're viewing it this way, it looks to your left side. But when I turn it around and have it right way up, those blocks are off center to your right hand side as well. Okay, and these oblong cuts are lined up so I can see right through the two pieces together. Okay, so that's important. Don't get that wrong. Although any mistake can be corrected with epoxy, but it's easier not to have to. Okay, so now I've got that set up, and I'm going to be very careful not to put these pieces, in a side or just sloppily, not lined up. I'm going to keep them lined up all the way through this gluing process. Okay, and another notch, another point. On these doublers for the drake tail upper support, the corners are notched. The corners are taken off right here, and that's because otherwise they conflict with wire ties that are going to go through these little holes here in the back of the 7A, 7B laminated part. Okay, so that's not a mistake, that's intentional. And when we glue the doublers onto the drake tail support piece, upper support piece, we do have to make sure that these corners stay clear of resin, where I was just talking about. Also, you'll notice that these two pieces, the doubler pieces, when they're aligned at this edge up here, they don't meet in the middle, and that is correct. They are not supposed to meet in the middle, because these two pieces, the rudder column support pieces, actually sit right between those two doubler pieces. So you can make that a real nice fit, but make sure that when you put real nice fit when you glue on the doubler pieces, but make sure that slot between the two doubler pieces does not get filled up with epoxy. So check that several times, and you can use a little square piece of the cut off from the end of the plywood sheet, some of the scrap from the plywood sheet, to create a little scraper to scrape that slot out. Because if that slot gets epoxy in it, you're not going to be able to get it into position where, actually these go this way, where the rudder post support column will fit down in there. Okay, so I think that's all the details that you have to watch out for here. And let's start gluing. This looks like about, let's go with 3 large marks of pre-thickened for these. When we're laminating thin pieces together like this, the pre-thickened will be plenty strong enough without coating the pieces first with the clear resin. Okay, and on these pieces, since they're symmetrical, it doesn't matter which way these pieces are glued together. It's like, oh, did I do that right? Well, yeah, you did it right. There are four options, all four are correct, which is unusual for there to be more than one way, and all the different ways are correct instead of some of them being mistakes. Okay, so I think we're ready we'll get the 3 large marks mixed up. We'll use our resin syringe for the pre-thickened. Just thinking 3 large marks, maybe a little bit more than we need. Let's go with 2 large marks to start with, and we can mix a little bit more. And then we'll go, so it's 2 large marks of resin, the pre-thickened resin, and that's going to be 2 small marks of hardener. Okay, that creates a 5-to-1 ratio, 5 parts resin to 1 part hardener. So 2 large marks of resin, which is equivalent to 10 small marks, and that'll be 2 small marks of hardener. The ratio is fairly important, so try to be fairly precise. Somebody did once mix it 50% hardener and 50% resin, and it sort of got hard, but not really. It wasn't sticky anymore, but it wasn't really strong either. It was kind of a little bit like rubbery putty, and so you do not want that. 5-to-1, 5 resin to 1 hardener. Now we're almost ready to put the epoxy on. Couple of notes though. With the resin, some possibility that it can have crystallized. It's not quite clear what makes it do that, but it's somewhat like honey. It just crystallizes and needs to be warmed up to go back to its original consistency. And it works just the same after you warm it up, and it's back to its original more liquid consistency as if it had never crystallized. So no worries about that. The other thing is on the epoxy brushes. See if you can see that against the table. The bristles are too long to work with epoxy. It really doesn't work very well. So you want to cut those bristles off so they're about half the length of the original bristles as they come on the brush. And if you squeeze the bristles between your fingers and then trim them, you can get a nice square cut fairly easily. It may take a little practice, but it comes out quite nice. There, so that'll work quite nicely. And now we're ready to mix. We have the 3, actually we went with 2 large marks of pre-thickened resin and 2 small marks of hardener. When I'm mixing small amounts like this, I don't always trust the bottom mark on my hardener syringe. So I'll often, like in this case, I pulled in 3 small marks of hardener into the syringe, and then I just squeezed out into my mixing container 2 of those marks, leaving the bottom mark to squeeze back into the hardener container, the original hardener container. Okay, so this small amount mixes quite quickly, but it is important that you mix it all. If it's not mixed, epoxy will never set off if it's not mixed resin with hardener. Okay, and so a quick coating. It's best to coat both sides, both pieces, and at this point the goal is to have just the right amount that will have a little bit squeezing out around the edge, but not a huge messy, clean up around the edges. And if you do the same side of both pieces, it's not going to work, so you have to do the mirror image of the second piece. And since we are coating both sides, not both sides of each piece, but one side of each piece, rather than just one side of one piece, that means a little less epoxy than if you were just. But it's a lot more thorough to coat both sides. That way you don't have any total void in there of uncoated wood. Okay, and then laying those together. This would be a good place for gloves. So I'm going to just get this one together, and then I'm going to get some gloves. Typically it's smart to get gloves before you start something like this, but I will be careful. Okay, and then a couple of binder clips will clamp these nicely. There. Keep checking. Epoxy is like grease when it's before it sets up. It's very slippery stuff, so you have to really check the alignment really carefully. Now that looks just right. There's some epoxy squeezing out everywhere. If there's any area where there's no epoxy squeezing out, add another clamp, paper clamp. But that looks pretty good. Only part I'm not sure about is right up here. Yeah, let's add another clamp up there. And then we'll have it for sure. Okay, that's good. Any epoxy squeezing out, it's a lot easier to clean off now than it is to clean it off later. Later on it'll be hard to clean off. Need to be sanded off. Okay, and that looked just right. If nothing is squeezing out, you may have some voids. You probably used too little epoxy, and on these small pieces it's really easy to pull them apart and put a little bit more on, because you don't want voids in epoxy work. Partly water will get in there and just sit, although the wood is protected by the coat of epoxy on both sides. That's one of the reasons we're coating both sides. But it's better not to have any voids at all. And if you don't have anything squeezing out at all anywhere, you're probably just going a little bit too light and probably end up with some voids. Okay, and then on these pieces it's nice because you can't get them wrong, as we mentioned before. Okay. Now you really don't want to get epoxy on your fingers. So plastic gloves are a great idea. If you do get any epoxy on your fingers, you want to wipe it off with paper towels immediately, very thoroughly. And a little warm water and soap can get it off as well. Of course, acetone dissolves it instantly, but acetone is bad for your skin, dries out your skin, and may make your skin more prone to having a negative reaction to the epoxy. Once you get sensitized to epoxy, it's very hard to work with it after that. So really try not to get any on your skin at all. And always have paper towels right where you can reach them easily. Okay. Now on this piece, I did coat inside the cutout on the second side, and I didn't really need to do that. It might have been a little cleaner if I'd marked that with a pencil first and avoided that area, but it'll be okay. I'll just brush the excess off there. As much as possible while you're clamping, try to clamp in such a way that you can clean off the areas pretty well. Now here it's really critical to get the pieces lined up from side to side. Otherwise your boat will be off center. Your boat will not be quite true. Okay. So take a little time to finesse that. Okay. Clamp down here. And one more clamp should do it. Okay, now on this piece, we do want to be really careful to clean out the big notch, but also the little notches at the outer edges, because that's where the doubler for the bottom has to have room to fit in there. So clean out these areas really carefully. If you don't get them clean now, you can use a file or sandpaper later, but it's a lot easier now. Okay, and then clean out the big cutout on the top, surface. This is a good time for gloves. These are just vinyl gloves, and they are cheap and disposable. Often easier to get gloves that are not powdered on the inside, because the powder does tend to get, when you take them off, and your hands are covered with powder and it gets on some of the things you're working on. Okay, now, so these two parts are going to be the same as the ones we just did, the floors we just laminated together. So let's move on to 7A and 7B, which have a few more components, namely these wooden blocks here. We've got it so it's set up right. When I'm looking at it, the wooden blocks are off-center to the right-hand side, and the two holes, oblong holes through the pieces, are lined up. We're going to line up the top edges and the cutout here, and that means that the side edges and the bottom edge do not line up precisely, but the difference between lining up on the right hand side should be the same as the difference between lining up on the left hand side, and it should be even all the way across the bottom, of course. Okay, now probably the biggest point is that end grain can soak up a lot of resin. Well, 2 points. These little blocks are going to have screws coming down into them to hold the servo, the rudder servo, in place. If you have the grain of the blocks running horizontally across like this, they're less likely to split. If you screw a screw down lined up with the lines of grain, it's more likely to split the block, which could be repaired with epoxy easily enough and not be a major issue. But it's easier if we just run as close as possible, run the lines of grain horizontal, like so. And that's the way I have these pieces set in here. And so we're going to start by coating the end grain first, because the end grain potentially can soak up resin, and we want to, if it does soak up enough that it looks a little dry, we'll recoat that. Okay, and then the key here is make sure you don't flip something around. Having those blocks in is going to help a lot. Now the only mistake we could make is not lining up the oblong holes, and somebody will do that. I'm sure. It's easy enough to make mistakes like that, even though it seems rather obvious. The obvious mistakes are sometimes the ones that are easiest to make, because you think, oh, no way I'll do that, and you stop thinking about it, and then you end up finding that you've done it exactly what you thought there was a name, and no possibility of having done making a mistake like that. Okay, and this is looking like we're doing pretty well with the amount of resin. We might be a little short with 2 marks. We'll see. You don't want to overdo the resin. It's super strong stuff, and it just makes a messy job if you have resin squeezing out all over the place. So this is a fairly thin coat, as though you're making a turkey sandwich, but you're being careful on the mayonnaise, because you know it's not the healthiest component of the sandwich. So fairly light. Okay, now we got it. Use the reflection of the room lights to make sure you have an even coating and that there are no dry spots and no places where you have more buildup than you need. It's hard to tell just by looking at it without getting a reflection off the surface how thick the epoxy is. Okay, and that looks pretty good. We have a couple of binder clips. And line up the top edges and the cutout edges. The side edges are not going to line up, and the bottom edge is not going to line up. Just the top edge and the cutout. Then check and make sure you have the same amount of excess at each of the sides. And try to get this part really precise. Time for, if you use reading glasses, good time for reading glasses. Yeah, that's looking good. Even with a couple binder clips on, it's okay. You'll find that you can still skid the piece around a little bit, enough to get it positioned correctly. And anytime you can, clean off any excess so you don't have to sand it off. Okay, and a couple more binder clips and we'll have it all set here. Okay, maybe hard to see at this point, but I'm using the standard binder clips, this being a standard one, but some of my binder clips have little foam inserts that I've created. If you're wondering about that, that's just 3/8 inch foam weather stripping, adhesive backed weather stripping, and you just cut it into little pieces and stick it on the inside of the binder clips. For this job, it's really not an important factor, but if you want to be especially delicate with your wood or something, I suppose you could use them. Just a little bit of a void right here, so we'll add one more clip right on that to make sure that squeezes together and has a little squeeze out, and then I think we've got it. Yeah, that looks good now, and it looks good all the way around. A little teensy thin line of shiny epoxy showing everywhere all the way around. Okay, I like that. Okay, that's good. And how are we doing? I think we have enough for our horseshoe piece here. The drake tail upper support piece. Okay, and coat the right side of these pieces, at least for half of it. We're getting a little bit low. Epoxy is a little bit like toothpaste. There's always a little bit more that you can squeeze out or get out of your container at least. Okay, lay that in place. And the other side. I can make a little spacer with a little bit of the scrap plywood off the edge of where you've taken pieces out, and make sure you've got the right spacing for these two doubler pieces coming together, and then you can actually use that to scrape off any epoxy that's slid off in there. And that's looking good. I'll get a couple of binder clips on here. You can see it is easier once you put gloves on to work a little bit more quickly because you don't have to worry about picking things up so carefully. The biggest thing with working with epoxy is to keep your work areas really clean. Always have paper towels at hand, and if you spill epoxy on your work surface or get on your gloves, clean it off. So having a roll of paper towels within reach is really a good trick. Okay, and again I'll just run this through here to make sure I don't have any buildup in there. Clean off the edges. A little squeeze out everywhere, that's exactly what I want. But nothing excessive, just a thin bead. Not enough to drip on the table or anything like that. Just a hint that there's no void, that there's epoxy. And then clean out the corners where we've notched those corners just a little bit on the doubler piece. Because you need those to be open, and set it aside. It's good. And then I think we do have just enough to finish this up. This pretty small gluing area here. You know, on this one, since we are short, not really short of epoxy, but we don't have large volumes extra, let's just do a quick pencil line to show where we want the epoxy. Okay, so we'll just do a quick pencil line here. There we go. And spread epoxy on the outside of that pencil line. And then we should have plenty. Just no excess, but just enough. Okay, and we're good. So 2 large marks was adequate, was really the right amount. If we get you mixing, if you find that you ran out, you're putting too much on. If you find that you have any extra, you're probably going a little bit light on things. So this is a good indicator for you, because my container is empty, but I have plenty for this last piece. So, so that's a very good indicator for you, as well as judging how much has been squeezing out. There's nothing left. Came out just right. Okay, and in place, our final piece here. And then we'll let these all set up. Very slippery stuff. Okay, and there we are. Last piece all set up. All not set up yet, but all clamped up and looking good. And we did have enough epoxy, so that is a very good way to gauge how well you're doing. If you got all these glued up with the two large marks of pre-thickened resin and two small marks of hardener, you are doing just right. If you ran out, you probably are putting more epoxy on than you need to, which is going to cause more cleanup mess and more work for yourself than you need to. It's good to use a little piece of wood to scrape out the corners really precisely, because that'll be easier when we get further on to have clean corners. Okay, there. And then just a final note on these mixing jars. I like using these frozen juice jars. I've used them for years for a couple of reasons. Partly, if you use plastic, cups, that can work, but you have to throw them away each time, and so you need a supply of them because the epoxy will flake off. It won't stick to the plastic. Whereas with these orange juice or any kind of fruit juice containers, the epoxy sticks, and as long as you don't leave your brush sitting in it when it sets up, you can reuse the container until it's got so much epoxy in it it's not got a lot of space left in it. So that's a lot of mixtures. So brush the inside of the container smooth so it's ready for the next time, and make sure your brush is sitting on top of the container, not down in the container, or throw the brush away. The other thing about these frozen juice cans is they have metal bottoms, and so if you want to speed up the epoxy process, which I did do on these pieces actually, you can very quickly and easily set the juice can against an incandescent light bulb, and it'll heat up the epoxy as you mix it, and it will set up twice as fast, at least, sometimes 5 or 6 times as fast, and sometimes instantly set up while you're still mixing it if you overdo it. So don't overdo the heat. Okay, I think that covers most of what we've done here pretty thoroughly, and that was fun. All these little parts are very, very fun and easy to work with. I did recently laminate a 40-foot bulwark rail, 6-inch high bulwark rail, 2 layers, laminated 40 feet the entire length with the same epoxy as this on a full-size boat, and that was quite a challenge, getting that much epoxy spread and 40 feet of bulwark rail, 6 inches high, clamped together the entire length before any of the epoxy set off. So this is a fun scale to be working on. I like this. Okay, well, good. Again, keep everything clean. If your gloves get too sticky, wipe them off. I mean, if they get sticky at all, wipe them off. And if they get so it's harder to wipe them off, just grab a new pair of gloves and start with new gloves. Okay, I think that covers it. You're in good shape if you got that part done. That's really all there is to it. I don't think you'll run into anything that's going to be too difficult for you. It should just be a real fun build and a real fun boat when we finish. Now we set aside the pieces that we glued together. They're still setting up, and but we can go on to working on the side pieces and starting that process. The side pieces are pieces shaped like this in sections, parts sheets 1 and parts sheet 2. They come like so when it's all assembled. You can see these parts aren't tabbed very often because they're such big parts. We don't need to tab them as often to keep them in place. These parts you can probably just free, just easily by kind of shaking them and breaking the tabs like that. Okay, so we have the 2 parts. And notice they're essentially identical, except one part has 4 small holes along the front edge. That's the bow of the boat. And the other part doesn't have those holes. drilled in it for you yet. So let's get these cleaned up and tab sanded off with the 120 grit sandpaper, and we will start the next process, which is marking the deck edge where the deck lines up with the sides on both the pieces. Now, in looking at these pieces, both sides may be exactly very similar, but one, or conversely, one side of the pieces might be cleaner or better grain or more to your liking, and you can use either side on these pieces. But remember that you do need to have a port side and a starboard side. Don't make two port sides or two starboard sides. These pieces have to be mirror images of each other. So that would be an awfully easy mistake to make, and it would definitely mess up your building. So when we start marking lines on the sides for the deck edge, we have to make sure that we have the mirror image. The way to do that is to lay the parts out in front of you as a mirror image. So get that out of the way. So we will be thinking in terms of trying to keep the parts aligned like this. That's the mirror image. So this side looks great here. No flaws there, and nice grain. And let's see how the other one looks. And likewise, this side looks really nice. So no flaws on either one. And usually, most builders will probably end up painting the hull and keeping the deck bright. That might be slightly more traditional, but actually it could be quite elegant to bright finish the sides as well as the deck. So at this stage you may be thinking which side is the more striking grain in case you do decide to bright finish it. Another aspect of plywood is occasionally in the sanding process at the plant making the plywood, there can be the sanding drums can create ripples in the wood, and those are a little bit hard to get out. Sometimes you can feel them, and sometimes you can look for them by getting reflected light off the surface. But these look pretty clean, so I don't see any problems on either side with these. Okay, so make sure you keep them in their book matched look. Now when I feel both sides, this side may be the smoother side for painting. So, and get all the fuzz off, the tabs off, and we will be back momentarily. Now in this step, what we're doing is marking a pencil line along the top edge. That's the top edge, the deck edge, is the concave surface, and the bottom of the boat is along the convex surface here. Okay, so don't get those upside down, it would be very strange. And you'll want a nice sharp pencil and a nice, fairly accurate ruler for this step. And let's check your pieces though. I just noticed I have a little tab that I didn't sand well enough. This step will go much more smoothly if your pieces are sanded, the tabs are all smoothly removed. Okay, now this is the mirror image of each other, but for this step I'm going to flip this piece over and line it up here. At the bow I'm going to make a mark a ½ inch down. This mark is not a ½ inch down from the notched out part here. At the very bow you can see there's a notched out part. That's where a mahogany piece sits in. We want to measure down ½ inch from the edge before the notch. So the notch is not considered part of this process here. So ½ inch down at the bow, and at the stern it's going to be 5/16 of an inch down. So a bigger amount down at the bow than at the stern. 5/16 is just over a quarter, of course. Okay, and then slide your second piece up, line up the bow and the stern, slide your second piece up to the pencil marks, and probably a good idea to clamp these pieces together, since we have paper clamps right here, so they don't skid on you and mess up your marking. And here, I want these to be quite precise, especially because the two sides need to be marked identically. Okay, and then just a quick pencil line.
There. Very good.
I'm going to continue that pencil line where that notch is, but I'll remember that it's notched down there. Okay, and then we're going to flip and do the same thing. Flip to our mirror image here, and then flip the top one over, and 1/2 inch at the bow, and 5/16 at the stern. So a little mark there, and a little mark 5/16. There we go. And again, we'll use paper clamps, the binder clips. Make sure everything stays in place. Okay, and again, remember at the bow, don't make a mistake. Don't measure a 1/2 inch from the cutout here. Measure a 1/2 inch from the edge, the continuous edge. So back about, not quite 2 inches back from the bow, where the cutout at the front ends and jumps up onto the true edge. Measure that the 1/2 inch down from the true edge at the bow. Okay, and then open up into your mirror image again, and now we're ready to do a line along the bottom edge as well. And again, these lines are on the inside of your pieces. So let's start with this one. Now we're just coming up 1/8 of an inch from the edge, from the bottom edge. So let's mark that. It's 1/8 of an inch at the front and 1/8 of an inch at the back. So the same, 1/8 of an inch all the way along, essentially. And again, make those marks pretty precise. If your pencil is dull, you're not going to do well with this step. So make sure your pencil is pretty sharp. And looks good. Line up the ends. And compare. Compare the two ends. Make sure they look the same. Side one done. If you want to check that line, you can take 2 pieces of scrap plywood and put them together and see if that line is the same as 2 widths of plywood, and it should be right on. It has to be right on. That's an important aspect of this. So yes, that's exactly right. Just the same width as two thicknesses of the standard plywood cut from a part sheet. Okay, and now the same thing for the second part. We'll flip over and get our second side set here. And these more precise markings, it doesn't hurt if you are used to wearing reading glasses. This is a good time to locate them and use them, so you can get this as precise as possible. And good light is the other thing. If you're trying to work in semi-darkness, you won't find your accuracy as nearly as good. It may seem like you can see well enough, but actually you get things into a good light and you realize that you really weren't very accurate. Okay, there we go. 1/8 inch there. Both ends look the same. And now go back to your mirror image so you don't mess up anywhere. And this is a good time to double check, make sure your lines are on the inside of a mirror image, two sort of butterfly halves, butterfly wings. At this point you could still redeem yourself by erasing the marks and switching them to the other side if you had messed up at this point. But later on that won't be so easy. Okay, and then we're pretty much ready for our first step, which is gluing on the stringer for the deck shelf. That's going to go farther down than the line, right up against the line, but not between the line and the edge of the plywood. It goes below the line. Okay, starting point will be to cut this to the right length. We want it to end an inch before the back end of the piece. The back end is the narrower end. That's the back end of the boat. So I'm just going to make an inch mark there and an inch mark here. Then we'll trim our piece to those marks. So at the back it ends an inch short of the back, and at the front it ends far enough back that it won't keep the two sides from coming together in a V. Fairly tight V at the bow. So we should move it back, I think 3/4 of an inch at the bow probably is about right. Of course, you could use a hobby saw for this lightweight material, but it works quite well if you just have a pair of clippers, and they can usually do a fairly nice clean cut also. Okay, so those are ready, and save your little cut off pieces because we'll be using those shortly. And let's do one more thing here. Let's draw a line 1/4 of an inch back from the very front of the piece. On one side that's where the holes are drilled. On the other side piece there are no holes drilled. So if you measure 1/4 of an inch back, it is just behind the holes. Right up pretty close to the holes, but just a little bit farther back from the edge than the holes are. And a pencil line there, and the same on the other piece. Now we want the two bow pieces to meet together nicely. We don't want to have a big square bow where the two pieces meet. So the next step, we're going to take our 80 grit sandpaper and bevel the bow back almost to this 1/4 inch line on both sides. So that line will give you an indication of how far back to come. So it'll go faster with your 80 grit rather than the 120 grit, although you could use either. Now, the key thing is we don't want to change this profile shape of the piece at all. We don't want to make the piece shorter by sanding the bevel all the way across and then starting to sand the outside piece edge more shorter. So just take your time doing this and see if you can get it just right. The angle of the two pieces coming together is indicated by the heart-shaped mahogany piece, and so you can refer to that and actually test the pieces based on that piece. So as we get this sanded a little bit farther down, we'll start testing it with that mahogany shaped piece and get the bows to come together at just the right angle. Okay, so we're going to be working on that bevel a little bit. We'll get back to you in a minute. Now, sanding plywood is nice because the inner laminations tell you how far you've sanded and whether you're sanding the entire surface evenly. So make sure that as you watch those inner, the top layer of veneer sand back, and you start to see the inner layer, which has the grain running the opposite direction, that inner layer stays about the same width all the way up and down. And then if you want to check to see if your bevel is about right, when you get both sides done, take the heart-shaped mahogany piece from the parts bag and put that in between the two pieces like so, and you can see if you have enough of a bevel for the bow to come together in a nice fine edge. This heart-shaped piece is actually going to be, in the end, will sit in where the notch is on the top edge of the two sides at the front, at the bow. And you can see that the heart-shaped piece is just the right size to fit in there. Okay, so make sure you don't, good to put this back in the parts bag, this heart-shaped piece, when you're through with it here, so it doesn't get swept under the table and in the trash or whatever. Okay, and it was easiest, quite easy to have the edge of the front edge of the piece lined up with the edge of the table, so it had a lot of support under it while you were sanding. And that worked out very quickly and easily. Okay, and now next step is going to be transferring these holes, the 4 holes at the bow. Those are for going to be used, we're going to use those for wire ties to hold the bow together when we build the boat, because there's a fair amount of force trying to pull the bow apart, and the wire ties will hold the bow together while the epoxy sets up. Once the epoxy set up, the wire ties will be taken out. Okay, so get everything lined up carefully with your binder clips, and now we'll just drill down through these 4 holes. So both pieces now have exactly identical lined up holes, different drill bits. A 1/16 inch bit is fine. That's the smallest bit in a standard bit size. Everyone should have that. But if you have any of the smaller numbered bits, that's even better, because the wire doesn't require quite as big a hole as a 1/16 inch hole. So if you have a numbered bit, a number 53 would be good, or anything as down to a number 55. Numbered bits go backwards. As the number goes up, the bit gets smaller, and numbered bits are graduated in sometimes as little as 1/1000th of an inch difference between the bits sizes. So compared to a regular set of drill bits, fractional drill bits, you have a lot more, a lot closer size differences between the different numbered bits, so you can get a much more precise hole, pretty much any size you want. So numbered bits are fun. If you don't have any, it might be a fun time to get them. They're not very expensive. A whole set would be quite expensive. I finally did find that I always had a size too big or a size too small, so eventually I finally bought a full set of numbered bits, and so I have at least one of each numbered bits all the way to where they're so fine that it's hard to imagine using one without having it snap on you. Okay, so a number 53 or number 54 or number 55 would be very appropriate, but a 1/16 inch bit is fine too. Okay, we'll drill those holes, and then we'll get set up to glue on our deck shelf pieces, and then we'll get set to glue on the little tabs along the bottom edge that help us when we're help us to align the sides and the bottom pieces when we get to that stage. So I chose a number 53 drill bit because I had them handy. Okay, so the 4 holes are drilled, perfectly lined up. That's the key, that those all the edges have to be perfectly lined up, or else your boat, when you wire it together, won't be true and even. Okay, so now we've got that done. Got our wood strips here, Got more space cleared out here. And we're going to use the binder clips again to glue on the strakes here, the deck support shelf. Remember, an inch forwards of the back edge of the side and about 3/4 of an inch back from the front should do it. In fact, we can check that measurement at the front and make sure that we have an adequate amount of clearance. And yes, that looks pretty good. That should do it just fine. Okay, so let's mix up. Probably just need one large mark. We'll do one large mark of pre-thickened here, and that should work fine. And you know, I didn't trim all my brushes to start with, but you may as well trim them all. You do not want any of the brushes with long bristles, so you can cut them all so the bristles are just half as long. One large mark of pre-thickened and one small mark of hardener. And again, I don't trust that bottom mark so much, so I like pulling in 2 or 3 marks and just squeezing out one mark and returning the rest to the jar. So we're painting along just below that line. So, and right up to the line. And again, if you use too much epoxy here, it's going to be difficult for you because it'll squeeze out up above the piece and it'll be a little hard to clean out. And the corner above the piece, and that's where the deck has to sit, so you don't want a lot of epoxy squeezing out there. The deck will be glued on too, so we're going to have plenty of strength and plenty of epoxy here for this joint, between this thin coat here and the coat that glues the deck on. So probably the biggest mistake here is to put it on too heavily. We're going to coat, again, we're going to coat both surfaces, so we're going to have twice as much epoxy to squeeze out as what I'm putting on now on this one surface. Epoxy is phenomenally strong stuff, and it doesn't take very much to hold a small boat together. Now at this point you could start to think about, you know, any part of the boat you want to bright finish, you don't want epoxy stains on. Depending on variable factors, sometimes epoxy stains will disappear under varnish, but sometimes they will be still noticeable. Especially fingerprints seem to be especially noticeable. So from this point on, let's try to think in terms of the floors. We weren't too worried about because they're hidden inside the boat, the V floors that we put together before. But at this point we're dealing with parts of the boat that will be visible. So so let's be careful not to get epoxy fingerprints all over the side pieces. Again, this is just a very thin coat. It's going to be hard to show you. You can see how much is on by catching the reflection of the light in the epoxy. Otherwise it's a little hard to tell how much you're putting on. But just a very light coating of epoxy will make this joint stronger than the wood itself. If you try to destruct this joint, the cedar piece will come into pieces before the epoxy joint will have any sign of failing at all. Okay, there we have it all coated. And we're ready to put our pieces together right to the 1 inch mark, 1 inch from the back. And here I've got it turned so I can't see my pencil line because the piece I'm putting on creates a shadow. So let's spin that around. Okay, and I've got to keep my butterfly mirror image by spinning both pieces. Okay. Now remember, you're lining it up to the line that's consistent with the edge of the boat, not with the cutout little notch there. And 1 inch from the back. There we go. Looking good. Watch your pencil line carefully. I would space the clamps fairly far apart initially and then come back and fill in between. We're just working on getting the alignment now, not so much enough adequate pressure everywhere. And you should be able to see epoxy squeezing out all along that joint. Okay, there, that's good. And then the second side is exactly the same. And we'll let that set up. And then we'll glue our little tabs on along the bottom edge. And we're making great progress here. It's going together fast. Now, anywhere where there's resin squeezing out, it's going to cause a problem because the deck needs to sit down into that corner. So you can take a little piece of, little chip of the plywood and make a little tool to clean out the edge. That works quite nicely. A slightly more acute angle than a 90-degree angle. And where you sense that there's going to be excess under the binder clips, take an extra binder clip and put it right beside the binder clip that's on there after you've cleaned out between the binder clips. And then you can clean out underneath the binder clips. You really do want this joint to be almost totally clean of epoxy. And if you used a very discrete amount of epoxy to start with, there's not a lot of cleanup going on here. But if you got a little heavy-handed with the epoxy, you're going to have more to remove now, of course. And it does make sense that there's more squeeze out under the binder clips than anywhere else. So you don't want to, even if you didn't have much, because the binder clips put more pressure on the two pieces. So even if you didn't have much squeeze out anywhere else, you definitely want to go along under the binder clips and clean off the squeeze out. Okay, so that's all there is to it. Getting these deck shelves on and then letting them set up. Okay, just have a few minutes here to work on this next segment, but I think we can get some progress made, and then we'll be back again soon. But the everything's turned out really nicely. The rails for the deck to set on are perfect and look really clean. And we did do a pretty good job of cleaning out the epoxy along there, so so that should work quite nicely. And these pieces turned out nicely, the ones we laminated together initially. There is a little bit of epoxy squeeze out where the paper clamps were on, but that'll sand off nicely. Since epoxy is harder to sand, now I'm switching to the 80 grit sandpaper. I find it easiest and more precise to hold the sanding block still and rub the piece against the sanding block. And again, I'd advise you not to use any power sanding equipment because the chance of sanding too much off and changing the shape of the piece, it'd be hard not to do that on any kind of power sander. But this as long as you were pretty good with the amount of epoxy and stuff, this part of the process is quite easy and fast. So sand those parts out, and any epoxy that's squeezed out. And then on this part, the 7A, 7B part, since we have our drill handy, this is probably a good time to drill out those little holes because they inevitably got filled up with epoxy when you glued the part together. So quick and easy to drill them out. Okay, and that's done. And then we can move on to these next pieces. Now, along the bottom edge of the side pieces, we'll want to glue on little cleats to help position the bottom of the boat. And I've cut 22 of these little square pieces, cedar pieces, into cleats from the 20-inch piece of material. Each little cleat is 3/4 of an inch long. There are a number of ways that you can cut those. I used clippers like so, and that worked quite well. These are actually use a utility knife blade cutting against a flat sort of plastic anvil plate there. But you can cut them with a mat knife or an X-Acto knife as well, or a little hobby saw, virtually anything. Okay, now placing these cleats is not just a random thing. So in placing these pieces, they'll set just above that 1/8 inch line, farther from the edge, outside the inside the 1/8 inch line. So they're not, if they were outside the 1/8 inch line, they'd be right at the edge, virtually at the edge. But they want to be 1/8 of an inch away from the edge because they will support the bottom as the bottom is positioned, or support the sides in position relative to the bottom. Now, if these are placed just randomly, you're going to find that you're probably going to end up with one or two right where the frame, the V floor frames, want to come out to the side, and that's going to cause a conflict, and you'd have to either take away, you either have to take away part of the V4 frame or take away your little block there. So positioning these little pieces correctly will save some trouble later on and allow for the V-floor frames to fit in without having to change anything. So let's get these measurements really precisely. They're in the instructions. The first cleat is placed, and these are measurements for the center of the cleat, not for either end of the cleat. The first cleat center is 1 3/4 inches back from the very front of the boat, the very front edge of the boat, front edge of the side. The next cleat is 3.5 inches back from the front edge of the side, 3.5 inches. Okay, so we have those marks. Now, the following cleats are every 4 inches starting from the center of the second cleat. So every 4 inches now. So there's a little more support there at the front, and now the cleats are a little bit farther apart. Now, if you put your marks right where the cleat's going to fall, you won't be able to see your mark. So you want to put the cleat, I'm going to put my marks right near the edge of the workpiece of the side. So, so I won't be covering up those marks with the cleat. And every 4 inches along there. These first two marks I put right under the cleat, so I'll move them down. Okay, and we can get those points marked on both pieces, and then we'll be back. Okay, now we're set to glue on our cleats, and on this piece my light is coming from this way, so I'll be able to see my 1/8 inch line, so I'll leave it the way it is. When I get to the second piece, I'll be working in my shadow if I don't flip that piece around. It's a good reminder, never work in you're in a shadow, because you'll think you're doing things right, and then if you get good light on your work later on, you'll realize that it wasn't as precise as you thought it was. And so use the best light when you're putting things together, and not later when they're all set up and you're checking to see if you did it right. Okay, so just a little touch of CA on these blocks is going to do fine, and best not to get the CA on your fingers. Positioning these really does need to be quite precise, or else you'll cause some warbles in your bottom of your boat. And so another good time for reading glasses if you use them. Okay. Now the accelerator you can use or not, either way, but if you don't want it to get bumped, you can actually hit the dots with accelerator before you put the piece on, and then the CA will set up faster. So probably the best timing is put your CA on your block, spritz the wood, and set the CA piece down in place. Okay, I think that you should be good with that. So get all your pieces on, and then we'll move on to the next step here in a few minutes. Okay, now we've nipped off the top edge of each of these little spacer blocks that we've glued on there, and so now they're triangle shaped. The bottom is still flat, and the top has been nipped off into, so our epoxy fillet, which will go along here, will not be hitting the blocks. We'll have space for the fillet. And now the next step is these little stiffener pieces along the front edge, along spaced, centered on each of the first 4 blocks towards the front of the boat. And I've cut most of them already, but I left a couple to still cut. The first ones make sure they fit in there. They're not too long to fit in. First ones go more or less parallel with the front edge of the sides with the bow, and the farther back ones go more perpendicular to the edge of the boat. So a couple ways to cut these. First is to mark them with a pencil in place, and so I put it in place and marked it with a pencil, and then these clippers work quite nicely. I want to show you both systems here. These are quite fast and easy, and a fairly clean cut, as long as those blades are sharp. Another approach is a little hobby saw. These are very fine-toothed saws and do a nice job. And probably of the two, the hobby saw is the cleaner cut, but it takes quite a bit longer to get it. And this is not, I think I have a couple of other hobby saws that maybe work a little bit easier than this one. This one, the teeth are not set. It doesn't cut a very wide curve, so sometimes it can pull a little bit. Okay, so and this piece will go right in here. Whoops, that one's just a little bit too long, so we'll take a little bit off of that. Just a little bit more. And we'll be putting these on with CA, so they'll be a very quick process. And there we have it. Okay. So again, we'll put the CA on the piece, and then we'll spritz the plywood and stick the piece on and hold it until the CA sets, because we want to make sure these are tight against the plywood. We don't want any gaps or anything. Just a thin line down the center, and that's going to spread itself out. So like 2 spritzes and put it in place. These we're trying to get more or less perpendicular to the top edge of the side piece. And it's good to hold those in place until it sets up, because the whole point of them is to keep the plywood perfectly flat there, and so holding them in place is the best approach. There we go. So you can see how fast that is. It only takes a few seconds. Now again, with the CA, you really don't want to overdo it and have CA squeezing out all over the place. You don't need that. Okay, I think you got the picture there. So we'll finish this up, and we'll have the sides almost ready to go now. So making great progress here, and then next we'll be moving on to work on the bottom pieces, the V bottom, and getting that all together. Gluing, first step is gluing on the doubler pieces, and then we'll drill the little holes through from one bottom piece onto the starboard or port bottom piece onto the other side, and then we'll add the frames, the V-shaped floor frames, and we'll have a bottom together pretty quick. Okay, good.